Hello, I'm Elizabeth McDonald. Welcome to We're Not Done Yet, conversation with retired United Church minister Gene Wilson. The United Church's 44th General Council will be held in the summer of 2022, but it's on the minds of all of us connected with East Central Ontario Regional Council because we're in the process of naming commissioners who will be attending GC44 on our behalf. Gene, you've been a commissioner to General Counsel not once, but 3 times in 1992, 2006, and then again in 2009. What got you interested in being a commissioner to General Counsel?
Well, I have to say that this all goes back to volunteering as an adult counselor at Quinmalac. And I did that for a couple of years. And then I was asked by our presbytery, because of my interest, to be a rep on the conference camping committee. And then that meant I would have to be a member of presbytery. So I started attending presbytery meetings and getting involved there. And when it came time for nominations for the 1992 General Council, I was asked if I would go because I was one of the youngest members of presbytery and there weren't other lay volunteers. So I went as a layperson to Fredericton in 1992. And I have to say that it was first of all a fun trip. I went with a person many of us know, Myra McWilliams, who was also a commissioner, and another friend who was going down to take part as an observer and then go and visit family in the Maritimes. And we just had a hoot. We drove down, we laughed and all the way down and all the way back. It was a good trip. But that's how I ended up going in 1992.
So what moved you then to go back and serve as a commissioner 2 more times?
Well, after the first attendance at a general council, what I learned about the church, good and bad, helped me get interested in the courts of the church. And I went on to get involved in several things, in both in presbytery and conference, and eventually at the national church level. But mostly from the people I met, people from across this country, passionate about the United Church of Canada, and also people from around the world who came to experience the National United Church Gathering, and to share their faith journeys. And we, of course, got to meet with them in groups, and some of them, one experience where one of those international guests sat at my table, and we really had a lot in common personally, and we really clicked, so stayed in touch after that. And I also laughingly say I got to travel the country on the church's dime. But experiencing the United Church in the different regions of Canada is a wonderful experience because each region of the country brings their own flavor, their own culture to faith gatherings. And after I was ordained and attending Con Ed, opportunities, I did go east and west to events to experience that education in a different cultural setting. So it's both the people and the passion about the church that I shared with many across, and that's what kept me going back.
So what were some of the pressing issues that you had to deal with? What were some of the big decisions that you found yourself part of making?
Well, in 1992, we were still feeling the fallout as a church from the decision in 1988 to not discriminate based on sexual orientation when it came to accepting candidates for ministry. And in 1992, we were still dealing with petitions, multiple petitions based on that matter. And I don't know why, but I've always been welcoming of people from the LGBTQ community. I think my parents raised us to be welcoming of everybody, but other experiences in my growing up just meant that I didn't see them as different people. I saw them as wonderful gifts to the church, just like everyone else. So that was in 1992. In 1997, I was a volunteer, and it was when we were dealing primarily, that general counsel, with residential school survivors. Mm-hmm. And it was very emotional, very moving. And the court, of course, I was just an observer, but the court was requesting quite adamantly that the United Church needed to apologize to residential school survivors. And they were ready to do that. But on legal advice, it didn't happen at that general counsel. It did a year or so later at a general counsel executive. But the debate around that was deep, and it was wise, and it was emotional, and so I remember that one. In 2006, we were in Thunder Bay, and I was a commissioner, and some of our Bay of Quinte members were on the sessional committee for our policy around Israel and Palestine, and our boycotting of certain goods made in the occupied territories. And I know on a couple of nights, many of us were up late, gathering in the common room with a little liquid refreshment, I might add, but to debrief with those members on the that sessional committee, because it was deep, and it was dividing the church to have to choose one part of that conflict over another. And of course, the Canadian Jewish Congress was involved in that, and there were demonstrations outside of our meeting room. So yeah, that was one of the other big issues.
Very, very sensitive issues and complex issues. Now, part of the responsibility of being a general counsel commissioner is to come back home and to the local congregation and in the area of the church to report back, to share something of the experience of general counsel, to share some of those tough decisions that got made. How did you find that experience?
Well, first as a rep from a presbytery, or just as a conference rep from my presbytery, we would gather those of us that went and come up with a report back to presbytery. So we reported the information. The reporting part was good. We each shared that and our experience, because we were all on different sessional committees and experienced different parts of the agenda in different ways. In 2006, I was a scrutineer for the election of moderator that brought, a little different experience. Believe it or not, the questions from presbyters were a lot more in-depth and doubtful about what the general council had accomplished, then congregations. That's where we got the grilling. That's where we got the hard questions. And that's where we had to really stick to our guns and say, general council isn't they. General council is us.
It's us, yes.
Because you elected us to go and be your representatives. But we also listen to the movement of the Holy Spirit in those gatherings.
Well, given the kind of response that you experienced at presbytery and in the congregation when you came home, would you say that being a commissioner shaped or influenced other aspects of ministry in the congregation or your presbytery?
Definitely. It helped my faith grow. It helped my theology change and grow. But it also taught me a wonderful model for caring for each other.
And more about that. That sounds very interesting.
Well, we became, even though there were often, in the heydays, more than 700 people at these events, both commissioners and staff and volunteers doing other things like hosting us. We became a family because we were, for a week in those days, 7 or 8 days, we were together. And we would celebrate with each other. We'd celebrate birthdays and anniversaries and other significant events. We'd pray and care for each other when there was times of crisis, especially when there was family emergencies back home and commissioners either couldn't travel fast back home because it was by air and difficult, or had to leave us to do that, to get back home. We also celebrated the diversity of our mix and the church in terms of sexual orientation, in terms of ethnicity and culture, and we celebrated our Indigenous peoples. And so that was one of the things that really helped me grow in those areas.
Well, it's very moving to hear you describe that. Now, Jean, you've also mentioned that in addition to being a commissioner, there were general councils where you were part of the volunteer staff. And there are many, many of us in this part of Eastern Ontario who can vividly picture you at a computer during a church meeting, being part of that technical support. And you were in volunteer staff as far back as 1994, I understand. Well, technology has changed so much since then. Can you take us back to 1994? What was it like to be volunteer staff at a general council?
Well, Bay of Quinte Conference was the first conference to engage in computer projection. And we did that at our annual meeting in May of that year. And when those planning general council found out what we did, they invited David Shearman and I to go to Fergus to do the same thing. So back then we're lugging our whole desktop computers, our computer, our monitor, our keyboard, and all the attachments that we needed to operate a computer. And the box that connected us to everything else was bigger than a computer. So in those days, that was the technology, and we plugged into it, and it projected on a screen. But they also managed then to connect us somehow to the audio and the video. So all we could do at that time was text. Film clips were shown and then on a VHS tape. There were no PowerPoints. uh,
You're describing a world that is very hard for many of us to remember, even those of us who lived in that time.
Yep. It then developed a bit in 97. I volunteered in Camrose. Of course, because I was flying, I didn't take my computer with me, but there were equipment supplied there. But again, the primary computers on the table doing the projection were desktops. So it meant hauling all that in. But we were using laptops for sessional committees at a time when people weren't even all using computers, let alone knowing how to use a laptop. So one of us volunteers had to go to each of the sessional committees to make sure that they got the computer up and running and knew how to use it, and be on call for troubleshooting. So that was fun to see that movement. In 2000, I was still using a laptop computer, only the General Counsel office supplied it. We were in Toronto at the time. There were two of us on the table, and connected to the Wi-Fi by a Ethernet cable that ran from the front of the auditorium where we were up to the ceiling, across the gymnasium, and into a hole that they drilled through the edge of a windowsill to the office where the internet server was set up. But we had internet. And it slowly developed primarily at the Bay of Quinte conference level, because we worked with Merv Buchanan, who came and showed us how to connect everything. So the computer staff were doing the typing, the editing on the fly, the projection of documents, of videos. We could put a background up if nothing was happening, or we could put the camera up if there was a speaker, so that those speakers then faces were up on the two big screens on either side. And that, as the technology developed, so did our skills and our abilities. And Karen McLean from Perth was the first one to go in to General Counsel executive and help with that. And eventually the whole team, all three of us, got brought in to do General Counsel executive meetings, because it meant no training, because we were already doing it. And the staff at that point weren't comfortable being responsible for all that.
So you've been describing enormous change, and I'm sure, Jean, you could go on and on. There's lots more that you could share. As you look back over all of these years, and you've shared with us so much that's changed. Has there been anything about General Counsel from your perspective that has remained constant throughout this period of great technical change and change in process? Have you noticed anything that's
I think our need as a Christian people to worship. Worship was key. And I was blessed to work directly with many of those planning worship for those events, because then I would take what they produced and make a PowerPoint out of it for display. And they were powerful worships. And eventually they became an integral part of what was up on the website, that all the worship was shared with the whole country, instead of just us experiencing it at the actual meeting. It was live streamed, but also was the scripts put up on the site as well. And I think that's the one thing that stays constant through our general through our general council experiences, and I find through many other church experiences, even if it's just a short Zoom meeting, or tonight I'm doing an interview with the Port Hope United Church Search Committee. They have a candidate they're doing a second interview with. We open with prayer and we close with prayer. And that's the thing that really, I think, is constant through our work as a church.
That shapes us and informs us. Well, looking ahead now to GC44 in the summer of 2022, there are a group of folk who have expressed interest. They're putting their names forward to be commissioners on our behalf. What would you like to say to those people who are getting themselves ready to serve as commissioners at GC44?
Well, of course, this is going to be a virtual meeting, so a little different than what I've experienced in the past. But I would say, first, be open to the Holy Spirit, because you will feel it moving in the midst of the work of the General Council, even sitting in front of a computer. Be patient. Try to be a good listener. But even in the virtual experience, you need to care for yourself, as it will, after 3 days, it will be exhausting. And so you need to do what you need to do to care for yourself through that. And we need to continue to, as a church, to pray for all those people who are gathering to do that work.
And what is there anything in particular you'd have us pray for? The rest of us who will be at home while GC44 is unfolding?
Well, I think that I don't know any of the business that's, of course, coming before the General Council. And just again, to gather and remember, as the General Council meets, they are us. The whole church elects commissioners from the regions. They're lay people, they're clergy, they're men and women, they're all ages, they're all cultures, they're all sexual orientation, and of course our Indigenous peoples. And everyone brings their own experience of the church, their own gifts, their own wisdom, their own cultural experience. So I think that we should just be praying for that group to gather, as I said, as family, as a faith family, with no preconceived idea who that person is, or that person, or that person. Get to know them through your experience with them.
Jean, thank you so much. Thank you for helping us to understand more fully what's involved in General Council. Thank you for helping us see why it matters, why General Council is important in the life of all of us who are part of the United Church of Canada. Really glad to be having this conversation with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Sweet sound, that's it.